Guys, good morning and welcome to the podcast. My name is Andy. I'm the clinical lead here at ReadyCare. So in this morning's session, we're going to be looking at something super important. This is really important. Now, after today's session, my goal for today's session is to get you in a position that you're more knowledgeable than your doctor. And that's not a difficult task at all, actually. Sorry, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but when it comes to which of your health numbers really matter in relation to what we know from the clinical literature over the last 10 years in particular. So I had just start with a quick story. I had a really interesting conversation with my doctor a couple of years ago. I am 45 and I had to think there for a second. I'm almost 45 and was stupid enough to think I could still do all the stuff I used to do when I was in my late 20s, early 30s. I used to compete as a kickboxer. So I was on the bag and trained doing a particular type of a kick, fell, smacked my hip off the ground. There was a cold kind of a concrete ground underneath. And so I went to the doctor thinking, is this broken? Should I go into the hospital? And he said, look, while you're here, we'll run your bloods. So I went back in a couple of weeks, bloods were back. And he said, how's the hip? Hip was getting there and it wasn't broken, thank God. And he said to me, God, your blood results look fantastic. You're really healthy. What's your secret type stuff? And then came to cholesterol and went, oh, actually your cholesterol is a problem. And I said, is it? Funny, how? And he said, well, your cholesterol is 6.3. And I said, so? And he said, well, you know, your cholesterol should be below 5. And I said, why? And he said, increased risk of heart disease and all that, increases your risk of heart disease. And I said, does it? How? And literally at the first line of questioning, I mean, it's his job. If he's going to advise me to go on a statin, which is a cholesterol lowering medication, and the inference there is that it will reduce your risk of heart disease, although the literature shows it doesn't, he should be able to answer at least one or two basic questions. So I said, what is it about my total cholesterol being over 5, which is, I know what you're working off, in the context of my good cholesterol being high and my triglycerides being low, no family history of heart disease, no inflammation in my bloods, and no other risk factors. What is it about that cholesterol profile that makes you concerned? And he said to me, and I quote, look, I don't really know, but the way we were trained is if cholesterol is over 5, I mean, I nearly fell off the chair I was sitting on when he said, look, I don't really know. And all I did was ask two simple questions. The first question was, what are you basing that on? What research? And the second question was, what is it about my cholesterol profile with my HDL, good cholesterol being high, triglycerides, bad, fats in your blood being low? What is it about that gives you concern? And he just couldn't give me an answer. Nothing at all. So our understanding of cholesterol as a marker for predicting heart disease has shifted massively. Now, when I say our, I mean the scientific community. So scientists like myself, some doctors, I would say maximum 5%. I'm being totally honest here. I spoke to our doctor and cardiologist who are both up to date with the recent science and said, what percentage of doctors do you reckon know this? And they said probably 2, maybe 3. No. So, and often I've heard this comment before. They go, oh, everything is perfect, but your cholesterol is a bit high. I wouldn't worry about it. It's probably genetic, which is just a nonsense way of saying, I don't understand why your total cholesterol is high and everything else looks perfect. The answer is total cholesterol being high is not an accurate predictor of heart disease at all. So let me get into the numbers. Now, before I do, this is really important to know. There is something called metabolic syndrome. And if you understand what metabolic syndrome is, you will reduce your risk. And if you act on it, you will eliminate the risk of heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, and arguably many of the hormone positive cancers. So things like breast cancer, esophageal cancer, prostate cancer, and so on. So certain types of cancer where blood sugar levels being high is the number one risk factor for it. And conversely, reducing your blood sugar levels is a powerful treatment, either alone or as an adjunct to standard treatments like radiotherapy and chemotherapy. Okay, so metabolic syndrome, we need to understand what this is, guys. It's so important. So many doctors are still looking through the lens of BMI, which is kind of a BS measure because it doesn't really tell you where you're holding your fat. It just gives you a rough idea of your weight for your height. A good example of that is when I used to compete in kickboxing, my BMI was 28, so I was technically overweight, yet I definitely wasn't overweight. I was quite lean because I was holding a bit of muscle mass. Now, if you're not holding muscle mass, BMI is likely a half decent indicator if you're not holding a lot of muscle, but it just doesn't tell you much about where you're holding your weight. So waist to height ratio or your waist measurement gives you a really good indicator of where are you holding your weight. So if your belt size is, or your pant size is over 40 inches for males or 35 inches for females, that is one risk factor. Now, how metabolic syndrome works. So these 5 blue bubbles here is, if you have 3 of these, you have something called metabolic syndrome. Not you're at risk of it, you have it. Now, 60% of the country have it, so don't worry if you tick these boxes. So if you are carrying weight around the midsection, defined as over 40 inches for men, over 35 for females, if your good cholesterol is low, this is really important. So this is hugely predictive of your risk of heart disease. Total cholesterol is not. HDL, left bubble there under blood pressure, stands for high density lipoprotein. Not really important as to what it is. It's kind of a brief overview of it is they are the carriers that carry damaged cholesterol particles out to the liver, but it's commonly referred to as good cholesterol, high density lipoprotein. So HDL or good cholesterol. If your blood sugar levels are trending very high, which is a massive risk factor for heart disease, your good cholesterol goes down. So for that reason, your HDL cholesterol being below 1.3 is bad. So it says 1.3 in females, 1 in males. I would broadly say below 1.2 or 1.3 for male or female is a risk factor. So that would be 2. So for example, if my waist is 42 inches and my HDL cholesterol is 0.9 or 1.1, I have 2 of those risk factors now. Now, if you have blood sugar levels that are trending a bit on the high side, so they're over 5.6, or you've been told you're pre-diabetic or diabetic, that is another risk factor. If your blood pressure has been over 130 over 85, now this is not, it was 130 over 85 and then I went on a tablet. You're going on the tablet because there's a problem. So going on a tablet is kind of band-aid therapy where you've got a hose that has 15 holes in it. It doesn't solve the problem of where the flood or the water is coming from in the first place. So if you're on blood pressure medication or your blood pressure regularly reads above 130 over 85, and just so you know what those numbers mean, mmHg means millimoles of mercury, and systolic and diastolic, all they mean is when you hear your heartbeat and it goes boom boom, the first one is a squeeze and it's shooting the blood out through the arteries out to the extremities, and then that's called your systolic pressure. So systolic means on the way from the heart out to your extremities, and then diastolic is when it's coming back in. So your blood goes out at a higher pressure that it comes back in, it rebounds and comes back in lower. So if you're over 130 over 85, that's considered high blood pressure. That's another tick. So there you have the 5 main risk factors for metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome basically is caused by your blood sugar levels being high. That's it. It's really straightforward. So your triglycerides being high are nothing, even though they're fats in your blood, they're nothing to do with fat in a sense. It's your blood sugar levels are trending high. Your body is saying, okay, we've had a big bowl of cereal here. That's 16 spoons of sugar I have to break down. I can't because I'm exhausted from doing it. Your pancreas is tired. So it turns the carbohydrate, which is glucose, into triglycerides, which are fats, shoves them into your liver. And when your liver gets full, it spills out into the bloodstream. So fatty liver is actually the beginnings of most of the stuff that can go wrong in the human body, which is why if you look at type 2 diabetics, for example, 90% of them have fatty liver. If you're overweight or obese, 50% of people who are overweight or obese have fatty liver. So fatty liver is the beginnings of everything going on. Okay, so let's look at these numbers and what they should be. Now, just before we do, this is really important. So why do we care about insulin? Now, when I talk about insulin, I'm talking about this thing again, metabolic syndrome here. So the cause of all these things going up, your blood sugar levels going up, your weight being stored around the midsection, triglycerides going in the wrong direction, over 1.7 millimoles, and HDL going in the wrong direction, below 1.2, 1.3 millimoles. They're all caused by the same thing, which is high insulin levels from your blood sugar levels being high. So metabolic syndrome, you'll hear people call it metabolic syndrome, is high levels of sugar in the blood. It's the same thing. So it is insulin resistance syndrome. Insulin resistance just means your insulin levels are going high. So why am I talking about insulin and sugar all the time? So if you eat sugar, we've had maybe 30 or 40 years of public health messaging that says National Fruit Confection jellies are fine because they're only 90 calories, and it's all calories in, calories out. I promise you that is the biggest load of nonsense that the food industry would love us to believe, because if that was the case, then half a boiled egg and a full packet of natural fruit confectioner jellies would be roughly the same thing. half a tub of Ben and Jerry's and an avocado would be roughly the same thing. They are absolutely categorically, demonstrably not the same thing. One of them will ruin your life and give you cancer in the long run and diabetes. The other will help you lose weight and optimize your metabolic health. So, and unfortunately, the other is the eggs and avocado and so on. I wish it was Ben and Jerry's. That'd be a fun way to live. Okay, so the reason this is so important is because the risk factors that I talked about in terms of the blood pressure starting to creep up, your blood sugar level starting to go up a little bit, gaining weight around the midsection, HDL going a bit low, your good cholesterol, and triglycerides going a bit high. They are all indicators that your blood sugar levels are high and you're heading towards something known as insulin resistance. If you have 3 out of the 5, you have insulin resistant, or to be more specific, you are insulin resistant. So when you are, that's going to lead to all of the things you see in the tree here. So in a sense, it's been a very exciting time to be a researcher in this area, because if you look at all the things it causes and we work backwards, we reverse engineer, it means that we can prevent these. And for many of these conditions, including PCOS, blood pressure, mental health problems, type 2 diabetes, and so on, you can treat them, you can reverse them. And actually, there's really exciting research now looking at certain cancers. If you starve them of sugar and keep someone on a very low carb, known as a ketogenic diet, not only does it stop the cancer from progressing and halt the tumor multiplication, it actually seems to reverse the cancers, some of them. Now, it's preliminary data. I'm not saying ketogenic diets reverse cancer or cure cancer, but it looks like they're at a very minimum a helpful adjunct to traditional treatments. So this is why it's important, because a lot of these things we see here in the tree are basically just manifestations of high blood sugar levels. So anytime I say insulin, just think high levels of sugar in the blood. So it's really important when we know all of this to know, first of all, what numbers do we want and where do we want them? And second of all, what foods do we eat to make that happen? So let's look at the blood test numbers here to make sure we understand this. Okay, so now you go to many doctors. This has happened to me, a really good story actually. I had a guy who, I had done a seminar in Goodbody Stockbrokers up in Dublin a couple of years ago. And a guy came up to me and he said to me, can I show you someone's blood results and I want you to tell me what you think of them in terms of risk of heart disease? And I said, sure. So I came up with a printout and he had covered over the name intentionally. So he kind of folded down the top of the paper. So he said, have a look at these numbers and see what you think. And I saw cholesterol was 4.2. So irrelevant, because total cholesterol tells you nothing about your risk of heart disease. His HDL was 0.6, very, very low, his good cholesterol. His LDL numbers were, I think, 2.8, 2.9, again, irrelevant. And his triglycerides were, I think, 7.3 or something like that. Now, if you're wondering, how can triglycerides be 7 and the total number be 4? How you get the total number is you add your good HDL, your LDL, you used to call this bad, and your doctor will often call it bad, which is a nonsense way of describing it. You'll know you need to change your doctor in terms of cholesterol advice if they refer to LDL cholesterol as bad. You add your HDL, your LDL, and a fifth of your triglycerides. So in this example, 1.1 plus 3, 4.1, a fifth of 4, around whatever that is, 0.8, 0. Something like that. So that would be 3, 4.1, 4.9. Now, roughly, it'll be a little bit off, but that's roughly how you get your total cholesterol number. So this guy said to me, the total cholesterol was 4.2-ish. HDL was on the floor at 0.6. LDL, I can't remember what it was. It's irrelevant anyway for the purposes of this discussion. And his triglycerides were through the roof. So he said, based on those numbers, what do you think somebody's risk of having a heart attack would be? And I said, honestly, knowing what we know about metabolic health through the lens of the research of the last 7 or 8 years, imminent. Like, do something now or you're going to have a heart attack in the next 6 to 12 months. He said, it's interesting you say that. And he said, I thought you'd say that based on your talk. Because he said, these are my bloods numbers. And I went to my doctor 8 months ago and he took my cholesterol numbers and he said, your cholesterol is fantastic. It's better than mine, because it was 4.2. And then 2 days later, I died 3 times on an operating table from 4 massive blockages, 95% blockages in all his arteries. So his heart was in terrible shape, but because his doctor didn't understand the new science, which says total cholesterol is kind of a nonsense marker in terms of predicting cardiovascular events, as is LDL cholesterol, and didn't bother looking at his HDL or triglycerides, he died 3 times on the operating table and was resuscitated and brought back to life. So this is why it's so important to understand these numbers, because things change all the time. So I work with a doctor, Donald Collins, an amazing doctor, an inspirational guy. And he always says to me, Andy, like, he said he's different because he's retired now and he's into the research of it and works with us. But he always says, always remember, 50% of what you learn in medical school will be incorrect in 5 years' time. And you have no idea which 50%. So what the doctor learned back in 1986 when he was qualifying, in 1994 or whatever it was that total cholesterol over 5 equals bad, and just tell them to go on a medication and that's going to reduce the risk of heart disease. But now we know better. Now we know total cholesterol is borderline irrelevant. I don't care if my cholesterol is 11, genuinely. I really don't care if it's 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Once my HDL is above 1.5 and my triglycerides are below 1.7. So for me, the perfect cholesterol profile, irrespective, I don't care what total cholesterol and LDL are. For me, and when I look at the patient's numbers, it's HDL above 1.5. That's the optimal. You want your HDL to be as high as possible, and 1.5 will be as good as it gets, broadly speaking. You see people with 2 points. I think mine was 2.6 the last time, but that's kind of unusual. I follow a very strict low carb diet. It's called a ketogenic diet, and do a lot of fasting and exercise and stuff like that. But for most people, over 1.5 is excellent. And then triglycerides below 1 would be optimal, but certainly below 1.79 or 1.8. Okay, I won't go into this too much, but there's another way of looking at your numbers, and this is what I discussed with my doctor when he had a blank look on his face, is that if my cholesterol is 7, and I look at my total cholesterol to HDL ratio, which is a well-understood way of figuring out for my total cholesterol how much is coming from good cholesterol, you would take the total number, let's say 5.3 in this example, and divide it by your good cholesterol number. And that says there's a 2.65 to 1 ratio, and anything under 4 is good. So that's a one way of looking at it. Although broadly speaking, I don't get too concerned about that because there are exceptions to this rule. I just go with the HDL above 1.3, 1.4-ish, and then triglycerides as low as possible below 1.8. That's the better way to look at it. All right, so here's the thing. We talked in the initial slide about high blood sugar levels leading to high insulin levels, and that causing your blood pressure to go up because of the way it affects something called endothelial function, which is the functioning of your artery walls. So insulin causing high blood pressure levels, insulin causing weight around the midsection and fatty liver, insulin causing triglycerides to go up, insulin driving your HDL down, and essentially high insulin and pre-diabetes being the same thing. So there's a really good study, and I always quote this study just because, again, when I said it to my doctor, he just gave me a blank look and he said, "Oh, would you mind sending on that study?" And then I did with a big, took me a half an hour to put it together. He said, "Send me a little bit on the research." Like he apparently allegedly was impressed. Classic doctor, like, and then said, "Send me on a couple of those studies if you don't mind." So I spent 45 minutes putting a big email together and referencing and stating everything properly as people in this line of work do, and he didn't bother his arse replying because that's what doctors do. Sometimes, not all of them. So this is a fantastic paper where they said, we're going to enroll people in a study, 30,000, it was males actually in the Middle East, who had a heart attack. So you could only enroll for the study and get paid to do it. I think they were paid $4 or $5 grand each if you'd had a heart attack. So you'd had a heart attack, you'd evidence that you had a heart attack in your medical record, and you agreed to have your bloods checked every year. So what they did at the end of the 30 odd years of the study was they said, let's look at all of the blood, all of the data, and see what is it that actually predicted these guys having another heart attack? What is it in their bloods that predicted them having another heart attack? Now, you say this to most doctors if they say, "Oh, your cholesterol's high, you should take a statin." Say, well, why is it? In a study done back in 2018, they followed people for 30 years, and the results showed having high cholesterol doesn't increase your risk of heart disease. They'll go, I don't know. This is our protocol. We just take a statin and stop asking questions. Stop being knowledgeable. Having total cholesterol of over 5, irrespective, now this is hugely important, irrespective of the threshold. So what that means is if your cholesterol was 5, you had, say, for example, a 1% risk of having another heart attack. If your cholesterol was literally 18, you had a 1% risk of having a heart attack. It did not change. It did not increase your risk of having a heart attack. So based on this research again, and everything we know over the last 8 or 10 years, why would I take a statin for my cholesterol being 7.2 just to put my doctor's mind at ease? Even though, and this is where it gets really kind of squirrely, have to be careful how I say this. I believe, to the best of my knowledge, if I were to say to the doctor, I'm not going to take a statin, and the doctor said, okay, no problem, and then 6 months later, God forbid, I had a massive heart attack and died, I think he might come under a bit of scrutiny as to why he didn't try harder to get me on a statin. Or they might look and say, how many attempts did you make to put this patient on a statin? That's despite the fact that I'm not all that enthused about what statins do or don't do to reduce heart disease. Let's put it that way. Okay, so LDL cholesterol, so the dreaded bad cholesterol, as we referred to it in the 80s, that being 3, which is a kind of a normal enough level as far as most doctors are concerned. 4, 5, 6, 7, 25 made no difference to your risk of having a second heart attack. Your blood pressure being high consistently, we know that. That's well evidenced in the clinical literature. Doubled your risk of having a second heart attack. That's fair enough. Incidentally, high blood sugar levels are what cause high blood pressure in 95% of people. Smoking, stress, alcohol, all of these things contribute to it. The biggest contributor by a mile is high blood sugar levels. And then having high insulin levels. Now, let's say if you have a heart attack, your risk of having a second heart attack, broadly speaking, is about 10%, roughly. Depending on whether that doesn't mean there's a 1 in 10 chance that everyone who has a heart attack is having a second one. But there is roughly a 10% chance broadly across large populations that you'll have a second heart attack. Now, if you decide to really clean up your diet and your lifestyle and control stress and quit smoking and drink less, your risk is going to go way down, way down. I'm not saying that's always the number. So broadly, let's say, just hypothetically, your chance of having a second heart attack is 10%. If you have high insulin levels, so high insulin levels come from eating sugar, jellies, sweets, cakes, pastries, frozen pizzas, granola bars, all of that bland, beigey, snacky, processed food, high sugar, high carb as well, not just high sugar. And your insulin levels are high, which they would be if you eat that way at all. You now have a 67% chance. You're almost guaranteed to have a second heart attack. So the number one predicting what we call biometric or marker in the bloods that would accurately project chances or predict chances of having a second heart attack was high insulin. And it wasn't even close. So oftentimes patients will go to their doctors, and if the doctors are really well informed, like Dr. Donald Collins, who works with us in the NHS, Dr. Niall Caldwell, they'll say, yeah, your cholesterol went up a little bit, but actually that does almost nothing to your risk of having a heart attack. Now, your blood pressure has come down, you've lost 2 stone, your fatty liver has gone away, and your insulin is rock bottom, and you've reversed your pre-diabetes. I don't care about your cholesterol going up a little bit. That's what a really good doctor should say. Unfortunately, the vast majority of doctors are traditionally trained to be alerted, let's say, when total cholesterol is over 5. Yet, I would say 95% of them can't even explain why. So, they are the numbers, and these are, very quickly, the foods that we should eat. Oh, sorry, that didn't come across straight in terms of the title. The foods that we should eat way less of, refined carbohydrates. There's going to be a time, I don't know if it'll be in my lifetime, it'll probably be, they say nutritional guidelines and medical advice changes one funeral at a time. So, all these so-called experts die off and the new gang come through and reevaluate all the literature, and all the vested interests are gone away. I mean, we know low-carb, high-fat diets are by far and away the healthiest thing for your heart. Yet 90% of places that you look online will tell you low-fat, eat less meat, eat less salt, eat less eggs, all that bloody nonsense that we've heard for the last 30 or 40 years. Yet we have a heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes and obesity epidemic across all Western world. And funnily enough, in countries who did exactly the opposite, no such disease occurs. So Inuits, remote tribes around the world, the Maasai tribe, the Hadza, the Kokoyu tribe, the list goes on. So reduce your intake of refined carbohydrates and processed foods. Don't be fooled by the nonsense labeling that says only XYZ calories. It's irrelevant. It's absolutely irrelevant. Refined sugars, so your kind of fizzy drinks, the artificially sweetened ones are about half as bad. So if you think you're drinking Diet Cokes, there's no sugar in these, I won't gain weight. 2 Diet Cokes will cause roughly the same weight gain as a normal Coke. So it's not a get out of jail card, but it is a little bit better. I won't go into the science because it's a little bit nerdy, but it comes down to something called the cephalic phase insulin response, which is an anticipatory mechanism whereby your pancreas produces that hormone insulin, which usually deals with sugar, because it thinks something sugary is coming into your blood. So it's kind of trying to prepare for it, which is amazing that it does that actually. So eat more fat, more protein, more, and I don't mean like Mediterranean fats, what we used to call good fats. I mean fatty steak, meat, cheese, avocado, chia seeds, dark chocolate, animal-based and plant-based fats. Eat whole foods. And here's a phenomenal bit of advice. If you take this on board, it will just do you the world of good. And that is, if you want to be healthy, never become insulin resistant, and massively slash your risk of all of these diseases that kill us prematurely in the Western world, shop in the outskirts of a supermarket 90% of the time. So think about your Super Value, think about your Tesco's, your Aldi, your Lidl. If you walk in, particularly Super Value is a good example, even because it's a more traditional layout. You walk in, you've got dairy, you've got meat, you have eggs, you have fish counters, you have fruits, you have vegetables. If all you did was that, eat the vast majority of your food from there, you will live 10, 15 years longer without disease. All right, guys, I'm going to leave it at that. Let me know if you found that useful in the comments. I always appreciate a little bit of feedback. If people don't have any questions, we'll leave it at that for the moment. Thanks for taking the time to listen to me today. And listen, I'm not saying for a second all carbs are bad. You should never eat carbs again. I personally don't really eat carbohydrates at all, although I had a week off last week and decided I'd go mad for a few days. And on that note, they're massively addictive in the short term until you really wind down your consumption of carbs. You eat 2 slices of bread, blood sugar levels go up, 45 minutes later they go down, and your brain says, do it again. That's why if you eat dark chocolate, you can eat 4 squares of dark chocolate and go, yeah, pretty good now, because there's not a huge amount of sugar in it. The fat fills you up a little bit. Whereas if you have 2 squares of dairy milk, for example, you're walking away from the fridge or the press, you're going into the sitting room from the kitchen, and your brain says, do it again. At all costs, do it again. Endorphins go off, blood sugar levels spike and crash down, and your brain says, do it. I don't care what it takes, do it again. And you bypass all rational thinking. So that's a drug-like effect that food has on you. Okay, I'll leave it at that, guys. Thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care.